In 1865, as it becomes clear that the war is drawing to a close, no one in Washington knows quite what to do. Abraham Lincoln cannot negotiate a treaty with the Confederate government, a government he insists has no legal right to exist. But neither can he simply readmit Southern states into the Union as though nothing has happened.
Because Lincoln would never accept the idea that the Confederacy existed as a separate nation, then there's the question of, well, just what was going on in the South then for those years, from 1860 to 1865, after South Carolina secedes until Appomattox? If it's not part of a separate nation, what is its status? And so there were these elaborate constitutional theories developed. Did Southern states somehow commit suicide, so they sort of ceased to exist? Or did they go to sleep? In essence, the abstract governments are still there, but they've somehow gone dormant. Or do they exist in a state of rebellion, but not actually an independent nation? That was Lincoln's solution. And the reason why that's important has to do with how representation will take place. When are you going to bring back Southern politicians into Congress? On what terms?
If you can imagine the South even more confused, their whole social system destroyed, vast portions of their land destroyed, railroad ties upended, houses, factories burned, whole cities burned, some of them by their own soldiers. When the Southern soldiers left Petersburg, when they left Richmond, when they left Atlanta, they set the fires to the warehouses and the manufacturing to keep them out of Northern hands. So the destruction was amazing and terrible. The Southern soldiers being paroled, coming home, trying to find their families. Many, many Southerners in the countryside were refugees. They really had nowhere to live.
Leaving aside then the physical destruction, probably the really crucial other salient point is the sort of psychological consequences of having a region where even those white Southerners who weren't committed passionately to the Confederacy still had suffered an enormous loss, the abolition of slavery, or as a result of Confederate currency being worth nothing, or the psychological loss of having committed themselves to a cause and then seeing that cause utterly and completely defeated. So there isn't any simple way to describe what the South must have been like in 1865.
The future is uncertain, and yet in various parts of the country, people talk about their expectations.
You had two goals, reuniting the country, but also emancipation and freedom. What did that freedom mean? Nobody knew what that meant. Not the ex-slaves or the freed people, not the politicians of the North, and not the Northern people. We do know this. We do know that the vast majority of white people in the 19th century were not ready for endowing black people with equal rights or giving them the full rights of citizenship. That would be a hard battle to win.
It's very frightening. And it's not as if freed people don't know what they want. They know exactly what it is they want. They want literacy and they want land. And there had been promises. In fact, some representatives had spoken to Lincoln, and Lincoln had said, well, what do your people want? And they said, we want 40 acres and a mule. We want the land that we have worked legitimately, that should be ours, or at least some portion should be ours, and we would like a free labor system as is set up in the North.
A logical thing would be to take property from the old planter class and redistribute wealth to the new freedmen, and maybe even to some of the plain folk in the South, the white people. But that flies in the face of everything that is capitalist. If property is not safe in South Carolina, then is it secure in Boston? And the answer, of course, is no.
Even before Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox, Congress establishes a Freedmen's Bureau.
Well, the Freedmen's Bureau had fewer than 1,000 agents to serve the entire former Confederacy. You can just sort of map them out and figure that that's inadequate number of people to meet the needs of former slaves, let alone the millions of white Southerners. And so the U.S. Army in the South ended up performing a whole host of other functions, bolstering the Freedmen's Bureau, as well as local military authority during the period of so-called military reconstruction in the South.
Just how extensive is this military presence during Reconstruction?
It's not as though there was a huge military presence in the South. Symbolically, of course, it was enormously important, because having federal troops in the South demonstrated the continuing resolve, tentative as it may have been, but still the continuing resolve of the federal government to impose order on the South.
Provisional plans for reuniting the country begin to take shape long before the guns are silenced.
I think Lincoln really believed that he could bring about a very peaceful Reconstruction that would not only reconstruct the South, but would also restore or replenish the Republican Party, and maybe even hold on to power in the most unlikely of places, the defeated South. So Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was rather gentle. As soon as 10% of those people who were eligible to vote in 1860 had taken an oath of allegiance to the United States, the states could rewrite their constitutions, write slavery out, affirm the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and rejoin the Union.
Many of those Republicans disagreed with Lincoln's lenient policy during the war, hated it, were ready to punish the South, did not want to let the South back in without making them pay a price. And that price would be not only emancipation, but perhaps black suffrage, civil rights, and other disabilities that they were wanting to impose on the South.
There were, of course, not that many Northerners who were willing to adopt that position because it had enormous implications and challenges for the federal government. But within those two poles, between get the Union back as quickly as possible and let's create a new Jerusalem in the South, there was a wide range of opinions.
Just a few days into his second term in office, Lincoln's life comes to an abrupt end. On the night of April 14th, 1865, as he and his wife are attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, John Wilkes Booth, an actor obsessed with the Southern cause, slips into the presidential box and shoots the president. Lincoln is carried to a house across the street, where he dies early the next morning.
A more disastrous event it's hard to imagine, coming as it did at a time where just only days before killing had gone on. What could have happened? We know that John Wilkes Booth was hunted down and a group of conspirators were rounded up, arrested, and later endured a military trial and were hung. But if we look at what its impacts could have been, well, the Northern Army was still in place in Virginia and other places in the South. The soldiers could have been so angry that they would go crazy. They would erupt into riots. And in fact, many Northern generals were afraid of that, and they calmed the troops. And they reminded them that President Lincoln, most of all, would have wished for a peaceful ending to this, that he wouldn't want a war to erupt over his assassination. And so it didn't happen.
The loss of the president is yet another chapter in the legacy of pain the nation has been enduring in this war between brothers.
Some 750,000 men are killed as a result of this war. Many more people, of course, lose arms and limbs. Many more people, of course, are psychologically estranged and distraught as a result of the war.
One such woman in Georgia, whose husband and 2 sons were killed in the conflict, refuses to comply with the soldiers' demand that she drape her front door in black to show her respect for the slain president.
And she, in her bitterness, told these Union soldiers, much to her later regret, I'm sure, the wretch deserved it. He deserved what he got. They were furious, of course. So the soldiers told her, "Where's that black crepe we told you to put up?" She said, "I'm not going to put it up." They said, "We're going to find it." So they went up, found a trunk, and there was her widow's weeds, the veil, the black veil that she'd had to wear when her husband had died. And they pulled it out and said, "You hang that up on the front porch."
The soldiers stationed themselves across the street, ostensibly to let her do this on her own.
After all, she lost all those men in her life. And so let her do it her way. The woman came out, got a chair, and she was going to hang this thing on this nail. Got on the chair, hung this black crepe, And then suddenly her body jerked, and they looked at her and said, "Oh my God, what's happening?" She hanged herself on the nail. And so they pulled her down, and it was too late. She died. But that was her answer. The complete, utter ruin of her life.
And at this very, very difficult time, Lincoln's vice president became president. Andrew Johnson, former slaveholder from Tennessee, wartime governor of Tennessee, loyal Unionist Democrat, who was put on the ticket in order to broaden the appeal for the Republican Party.
Johnson put a foot on every rung of the ladder of political success in Tennessee. He had been mayor of Greenville, Tennessee. He had been a state representative, a state senator. He had been a United States representative, a United States senator. He had been provisional governor of Tennessee under the Lincoln administration. He was now vice president. He was vice president because Lincoln believed he needed, in the campaign of 1864, a loyal Southern face, of course, which Andrew Johnson was.
So he seemed to have some political strengths. But when he succeeded to the presidency, barely a month after the second Lincoln administration started, it was not terribly long before it became clear that he was much less skillful as a politician than Lincoln.
His program was to let the southern states reconstitute their governments and come back into the national government as quickly and painlessly as possible. And in order to get the top tier of the southern class back into action, back into politics, back into leadership positions, he issued a proclamation of amnesty, which allowed that top tier, the elite of the South, to apply for amnesty to the president himself. So he had all these thousands, I think he issued 6,000 by September of 1865, to the horror of the North. But Johnson liked that. He liked the fact that these slaveholders, the wealthy men who didn't have so much in common with him before the war, had to come to him and ask them. And he granted them left, right, and center.
And indeed oversaw the restoration of a number of former Confederate states. But restoration is not reconstruction.
So when Northerners looked at the presidential version of Reconstruction, they saw that Southern society was replicating itself as quickly as possible and not even missing a beat. Also voting in ex-Confederate generals and ex-Confederate politicians into the National Congress.
It was one of the tragedies of Reconstruction that white Southerners didn't realize fully consequences, the symbolic consequences of their decisions when they selected who they selected to represent them in Washington. It was, of course, going to be intolerable to Northerners to have the former vice president of the Confederacy representing the state of Georgia in Congress. It was intolerable, even though Stevens himself, former vice president of the Confederacy, was not one of the most fire-breathing secessionists, and many of the most rabid secessionists before the Civil War were not sent to Washington after the Civil War to represent the South. Even so, you couldn't have Confederate generals and Confederate bureaucrats, administrators, politicos coming to Washington in 1865. The consequence of that was, of course, the eruption of a fierce dispute between Andrew Johnson and congressional Republicans about the future course of what to do with the South.
And whereas Lincoln, when someone disagreed with him, might sit down with that person and try to reach some kind of accommodation, and he had an ability to see the other person's point of view, Johnson dug in his heels. And that made it inevitable, really, that he would have very grave difficulties with the Congress.
And in the fall elections of 1866, Andrew Johnson took what he called a swing around the circle in trying to persuade Americans to vote for his version of Reconstruction in the election of 1866, which meant Northern Americans at that time. He lost badly. He appeared drunk and didn't make sense. Well, in a nutshell, the Republicans had a great election victory in 1866 in Congress.
And so Republicans in Congress start ratcheting up their demands for what it will take for the South to be represented in Congress in the future. And congressional Republicans were driven both by pragmatic concerns as well as principle. On principle, they just didn't want to have treasonous Southerners in Congress within months of the time that they had been fighting against the Union. On practical grounds, they were deeply concerned that there was going to be a revived Democratic Party in the South linking up with the Democratic Party in the North and challenging the Republicans who had just waged and won the war for the Union. The only way to do that was to empower blacks. And to empower blacks meant they had to challenge the whole power structure of the antebellum South. And they had to literally rewrite the American Constitution.
And so they started putting forth a number of bills that comprised the most radical version of Reconstruction that was possible, including a Civil Rights Act, including the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, including a number of very important what were called Reconstruction Acts. Andrew Johnson vetoed every single one of these acts. Congress overrode his veto because they had the vote.
It was an institutional struggle of monumental proportions between the Congress and the President. And Johnson always claimed that he was defending the Constitution, that Congress was overreaching itself, particularly in how it was dealing with the South.
It was a time when there was the most constitutional change in the history of the United States since the Bill of Rights. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery, which was the most important economic institution in the United States at the time. So it freed people who had been slaves since 1607. In the 14th Amendment, it made them citizens and guaranteed them equal protection of the law. It guaranteed them against state infringement of their privileges or immunities. It guaranteed them due process of law. This was the single largest constitutional change since 1791. And then the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote, which had been very controversial. They had had the right to vote in the New England states in 1860, but really very little anyplace else. So they were very hopeful. They thought that they would be citizens just like white people.
The other factor of the Republican Congress in their struggle over Johnson is that they had the power to throw out all of Johnson's Reconstruction governments. They started from ground zero. A series of Reconstruction Acts divided the South up into 5 military districts and presented each commander of the military district with an explicit procedure of what Southerners would now have to do in order to get back into the Union. And so after 1868, the true process of Reconstruction began.
In 1870, the 15th Amendment passed. 62 days later, the Congress passed the First Enforcement Act. It was a very strong act. It provided for protection of all citizens, not just blacks, but whites too, or anybody else, against infringements of their right to vote or anything that would help them vote, like going to the polls. If you murdered somebody when they were going to the polls, this was illegal under the First Enforcement Act. If you stuffed the ballot box, if you passed poll taxes as Kentucky did, that seemed to be too high. And so there were challenges that were brought to various practices.
President Johnson is no longer a serious obstacle to the passage of radical legislation, but he still is the person responsible for administering Reconstruction programs. The radicals have little confidence in his motivation to do so.
Many members of Congress decided that Andrew Johnson would have to be impeached. He would have to be impeached because he was an obstructionist. It was a question of justice. If the South wasn't going to accept emancipation, if they were going to try and put black people back in a labor system that wasn't free, then what was the point of the war? What was the point of the war? This was also a factor in the drive toward the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, which gained steam after Congress passed a Tenure of Office Act.
Johnson, still combative in his dealings with Congress, decides to test the validity of this act, which limits his ability to fire members of his cabinet without congressional approval. He fires Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, an ally of the radical Republicans.
This was a challenge that the Republican Congress were ready to take up, and they were ready to begin impeachment proceedings against Andrew Johnson for violation of the standard of the Tenure of Office Act, but also for stopping the Congress from implementing its Reconstruction policies, which in their minds was more serious and lends credence to the charge later leveled against the impeachment process as being one that was politically motivated, which it was. It was about the war and the meaning of the war and the direction of Reconstruction.
He was impeached, which means, of course, to accuse. The House of Representatives brought him to trial in the Senate, and he escaped conviction by a single vote and sort of rode out the rest of his 8 months in office with diminished, obviously, popularity, which had not been very great to begin with. What does that mean for the future of the presidency? Well, what it meant was that presidents who came after him faced the challenge of, in a sense, reviving the presidency, of bringing it back to an assertive office in the national government in a way that would be effective.
The balance of power among radical and more moderate Republicans is changing as well.
The fact is that at that moment, the radical Republican vision, possibly the most progressive as far as the blacks were concerned, was diminished. As moderate Republicans came into power, they nominated their candidate, Ulysses S. Grant, who was a favorite of the northern people, but also of politicians who believed he was the only man who could possibly serve as president during these years. And I think they were right. I think that Ulysses S. Grant was the right man in the right place, and that as difficult as his presidency was, his stature prevented Reconstruction from being much more of a disaster than it was.
It's hard to imagine anybody succeeding in bringing about a peaceful Reconstruction in a way that would have given African Americans, the former slaves and their families and descendants, the rights that they, according to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment of the Constitution, deserved. He tried. On occasion, he would use troops in the South, but more and more in Northern public opinion, there was a feeling that you can't forever uphold governments by the use of the military.
Grant enters the White House with no political experience, and his performance, according to some critics, is clumsy and ineffectual from the start.
Basically, I think what Grant did was to give the nation an assertive president who was not always wrangling with the Congress, who, in fact, worked quite well with Congress on some issues. He could take issue with the Congress when he needed to. In fact, in 1874, he vetoed an inflation bill. Many of the members of his party thought this was something that should be done. He said no, and he won respect, granted, in a lot of important conservative circles in the country for that action.
However, scandals involving members of his cabinet begin to surface during the 1872 campaign. Compounding Grant's problems is a financial crisis that had its origins in the Civil War.
In wartime, governments have to raise lots of money. There are three basic ways for raising money. You tax people. Nobody wants to be taxed. Tax means paying now. Although they do pass an income tax during the Civil War, which is later declared unconstitutional. You borrow money. Borrowing is always better than taxing because you get the money now and you pay for it later. And the United States government does borrow money during the Civil War. But you don't want to borrow more money than you absolutely have to. So that raises option number 3, which is you just print lots of money. These are the so-called greenbacks. So after the war, after industrial recovery begins and things are returning to normal, there starts up a movement to resume specie payments, which means, of course, to go back to payments in gold and silver, which is supposed to be more reliable than paying with paper money. Now, this is one of those points in history where you say, well, who could possibly be against that? But in daily life, the answer is, well, it depends who you are. People who are debtors tend to like greenbacks, and farmers are chronic debtors. Why? Because farmers are in a cyclical business. They literally plow all of their capital into the field, and then they have to wait till they can harvest it back in the fall.
Despite the opposition of farmers, Congress passes the Species Redemption Act, in effect putting the United States back on a gold standard.
This makes the dollar more convertible with other international currencies, and so conceivably makes it easier to invest overseas or to have overseas investment comes in or to engage in foreign trade. The problem with gold as a currency in the late 19th century is there's only a fixed amount of gold in the world. And that means if you want gold to be the basis of your currency, you have to be very careful how the value of your currency is set.
The consequences of the Civil War and government efforts to reunite the country will have repercussions for years to come, even in the North.
Reconstruction, which can be very simply defined as the bringing back together of the country after the war, politically, socially, economically, was a long and difficult process. Many historians have described Reconstruction as a stepchild of the Civil War, as people tend to lose interest after Appomattox. You have this glorious culmination of this tragic story, tragic and dramatic, and the families reunited again. But it's not really. It's only really the beginning of the story, and you can't understand the Civil War without understanding Reconstruction. So I see Reconstruction as the end of the story of the Civil War, and a very troubling one it is too, because it has no neat and tidy bow tie, no neat and tidy ending like Appomattox. In fact, many of the issues of the war era we're still dealing with today.
Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.